I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast. On this week's episode, I'm joined by Stanley Tucci to talk about his new book. We're going to get to that conversation after the break. First, however, Jumana Khatib, an editor here at the Book Review, is with me for a short look at the National Book Awards, which will take place in mid-November. Specifically, we're looking at the 5 fiction and 5 nonfiction titles that are in the running. We're not going to be talking about poetry or translated literature or young people's literature, all of which are important in their own ways, but which I am certainly less familiar with nominee-wise. Jumana, hi.
Hi, Gilbert. Thanks for having me on.
5 and 5. We've both read them all. That's not true at all. You've probably read more than I have. Which do you want to start with?
Let's start with fiction,
okay,
and then we can go into nonfiction. Let's start in chronological order of what came out first this year. So that would be Hashem Matar's book, My Friends. This is by a Libyan British writer. He has received the Pulitzer Prize for his amazing autobiography called The Return. It's a story of his father who was kidnapped by Gaddafi's regime, and it's a real mystery what happened to his remains, and it's a story about Libya and what happened to his country. But he started as a novelist, so even though Matar's profile really rose with the nonfiction, his origin is as a fiction writer. My Friends is Matar's first novel in 13 years, and it follows 3 Libyan exiles in London. They're there during the Gaddafi regime. They're unable to return back to Libya, and they have these really remarkable lifelong friendships. They all take very different paths. Like any kind of group of friends, they come together, they fall out. It's a pretty beautiful and quiet story.
Jumana, there's a particular reason that you know this author particularly well.
Yes. So I did write my college thesis on his first 2 novels, and then I profiled him for the New York Times this year. One thing, and this is the thing that kills me about profile writing, is that there's so much that gets left on the cutting room floor. But one thing that Hashem told me when I interviewed him, so one of the pivotal moments of this book happens this is a real life demonstration in London where Libyans were fired upon by embassy members. And Hashem had known that he had a friend of his who was at that demonstration in real life, and he knew that this was happening, and it was in the back of his mind when he was writing the scene. And when he gave the scene to his friend to read, his friend sort of like read it and unbuttoned his shirt and showed him that the exact injury that Hashem gave his character was exactly what his friend actually had. And it was this remarkable moment of like when your mind melds with a friend.
Oh my God.
It was pretty moving. Yeah.
Cutting room floor. I know. And I know. It kills me. So I'm so glad to be here to alleviate this guilt. That is My Friends by Hashem Matar. We have discussed on this podcast the book James by Percival Everett, which to me, from the moment it published earlier this year, seemed like it was always going to be one of those books that was really going to dominate the conversation for all of 2024. I think many people predicted that it would get nominated for various awards. It is nominated for the Booker, nominated for the National Book Award here. And it is, as we have discussed, essentially a retelling of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain from the perspective of Jim, the enslaved person who, in this book, goes by James. Percival Everett has written many books. A lot of people became more familiar with him this year when one of his books was adapted into the film American Fiction, which won an Oscar. But is this his breakout? Is this Everett's breakout?
I think so. Yeah. I think this is his biggest commercial book. I think this is his most widely read book. And I think that this is probably the book that is making the biggest mark in real time for him. And I say that as somebody who's read and loved Percival Everett for years.
Why do you think this is the one that is resonating the most with readers, with the market, with audience, with awards bodies?
I think it's fortuitous timing. I think that had this book come out prior to 2020, this might have been a very different cultural moment to publish into. I also think it helps that he's grappling with a centerpiece of American literature. There's so many people that understand what Huck Finn is and are familiar with it and are of an age where we can really grapple with its omissions and its blind spots. And he does so in a way that's accessible, but also really challenging. It's funny. Frankly, it's a little less abstruse than some of his other works. And again, I say that as an Everett lover. But it has all the hallmarks of what you really love to see in his writing, which is that wit and the intelligence. And really, he holds people's feet to the fire and challenges his readers in a way. If you've not read Percival Everett, I really think this is the book to start with.
I agree, though I think if you start with this and then you expect Percival Everett's other books to be like this, you might be surprised. It is pretty accessible, whereas some of his books are a little more stylistically and conceptually complex.
Yes.
And listeners, if you haven't listened to our book club discussion on James by Percival Everett, you should go back. We recorded that one in May. The next book on our list is one that several people on the desk were talking about last December, or even around Thanksgiving. I feel like a couple of people had read it early, which we have the privilege of doing here at the book review, and said Martyr by Akbar is one that we are going to be talking about for quite a while. And indeed, it's shortlisted here.
This is the debut novel by Akbar, who's a poet, or origins as a poetry writer. Really beautiful poet, a lot of poems in The New Yorker. And this is a pretty wild, I don't even know if I want to call it a coming-of-age story, but it follows a young man who is grappling with addiction, grappling with profound grief. He is Iranian-American. He was raised in the States. One of his earliest wounds, maybe not the core wound, but one of his earliest wounds is that his mother was killed in an airplane crash when he was a baby. And so he and his father come to the States and try to eke out this very... It's a loving, confused, they don't totally understand each other. And it's a hard scrabble life. His dad works in a chicken processing plant. And so the character is a writer, he's a poet, he's really tormented by his demons. And I think the one thing I will say about this novel, this is a really voice-driven book. I would say that the plot is almost secondary to it. But I think part of the reason that our colleagues were responding to this even a year ago, and that feels unthinkable, was just because this is a voice unlike anything you've really encountered in recent fiction. Completely memorable, and there's a good story behind it, too.
When did you read this book?
I think I read it in January. I was not one of the first to read it on the desk, but I was an early reader. And you're gonna roll your eyes at me, Gilbert. I love dead parent books, so I knew that this was. I knew I was gonna read this one, and I had been reading Kaveh Akbar for years, his poetry, and I was really seduced by the voice of this character, who's funny, insouciant. You want to shake him, makes terrible decisions, and it's heartbreaking. Any story of addiction is ultimately a story of profound heartbreak, I think.
The next book on the fiction shortlist is one that we have neither of us has read. I don't believe we reviewed it at the Times, which happens. Listeners, I don't know, but there are a lot of books out there, and even a place like the New York Times Book Review, which is lucky enough to have a bunch of people reading all the time. We still can't get to everything. So Ghost Roots by Pemi Aguda is a debut collection of short stories. I think they're all set in Nigeria. They're set in Lagos, and we're going to get around to reading it.
Yeah, I look forward to it.
Yes.
I look forward to it. This is the one thing that's always really nice about award season, is that it helps me understand my own blind spots, or helps remind me to go back to things that I didn't have time to read at the time.
I think a lot of people have picked up the next book, which is All Fours by Miranda July. Have you heard of it?
Oh, I think I've heard rumblings by possibly every single person I've ever met in my life. This was
How many of them are men?
Actually, remarkably few. I've made it to 33 with very few men in my life, which I consider an accomplishment.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I know. I'm so delighted to be here today. This was the book in every tote bag on every uptown train this summer. This was at Fort Tilden every single time I went. Everybody was reading this book. This was sort of like I'm going to try and put a pastiche into the way this was described. It was like Madame Bovary in perimenopause. It was like, it was a coming of age story about a female midlife erotic crisis. Anyway, I will leave it to you listeners to decide how you want to characterize it if you read this. I can give you the scaffolding of this story. Miranda July is a multidisciplinary artist. She often uses a lot of autofictional tropes in her work, whether it's her writing or her films. And so this is also a somewhat autofictional story. And it follows a woman she's an artist of some renown. She's just gotten a somewhat moderate sum of money, and she decides that she wants to go on a 2-week cross-country trip from her home in LA to New York City for her birthday. She has a young child at home and it was a harrowing birth, and the child's about 8, and the woman and her husband, Harris, I think they're in a strange period with the arrival of their child. They've gone through this trauma together, and it's almost like an ecstatic kind of pain is how Miranda July describes it. But their marriage is off kilter. It's a hard thing to accept into your emotional dynamic, and they're still negotiating it. So the narrator sets out. She makes it like 40 minutes outside of Los Angeles, and she is completely smitten with this mechanic named Davy. He really becomes like an erotic fantasy for her. So she keeps up the ruse. She tells her husband and her kid, oh yeah, I'm still making my way to New York. But basically she camps out in this like suburb of Los Angeles. She pays the mechanic's wife to redesign a hotel room.
A motel
room. Sorry. Words matter.
Yeah. That's what makes it even funnier.
So she basically spends all this grant money or not grant money, but this sum that she's gotten. I think it's royalty money. Anyway, to renovate this motel room. And it's crazy, but it awakens in her some kind of, she's able to access something in herself she hasn't been able to touch before. And then she does go home, and she comes home a changed woman, and it changes her marriage and her relationship with her kid and her friends. And it's I don't know how many of us have the luxury of driving 40 minutes outside of town and setting up shop, but I think people are responding to it for a reason. There's an idea of having a transformation moment or meeting a new side of yourself after you think you know who you are.
Duly noted. Okay.
Next.
All right, Jumana, let's head on over to nonfiction. Again, 5 nominees here. We, at the book review, have reviewed some of these books, some of them we have not. But I'd love to start with one that really, at the beginning of the year, we assumed would be one of the biggest books of the year. It was a big deal when it came out. This is Knife by Salman Rushdie.
Knife it's a miracle of a book, if you ask me. So this is Salman Rushdie's memoir of the attack in 2022 that almost claimed his life. It was a horrible, harrowing, violent attack. He was stabbed on stage, about to have a conversation about freedom of author rights. Rushdie's not a young man, and it was, his injuries were severe and extensive, and he's blinded in one eye, and his mobility is limited. And at the time, he said, I'm probably not going to write about this. But as time went on, I think Rushdie, being who he is, he actually finds some kind of relief, profound relief or healing in his writing, because he's been in the public eye for so long. So this is his memoir of what it was like to recover. Some of the writing about his physical injuries, which were grievous, are unforgettable, like an eye, like a soft-boiled egg. And also in there, he weaves in an appreciation for his wife, who really cared for him and helped him and was a real ballast for him as he is trying to figure out what life feels like now. And to Rushdie's credit, I think he spent a lot of his life in hiding. And even though he was completely taken aback by this attack, he's been circulating, even in his sort of reduced state. He's been at parties, he's been out. And I think it's a real act of courage and a way to claim ownership of what happened to him to the extent that that's possible.
This is Rushdie's second memoir. You mentioned him having been in hiding for quite a while after the fatwa in the 80s. If any of you listeners are interested in reading about that period, the name of that book is Joseph Anton. It's more than twice the size, I believe, of Knife. Knife is, it's really a slim recounting specifically when he details the attack from his perspective. It is really unforgettable. As I said, there are a few books on the National Book Awards nonfiction shortlist here that we haven't read, but are worthy of mention. The first is Whiskey Tender by Deborah Jackson Taffa. This is another memoir. This is a memoir by the director of the MFA program at the Institute of American Indian Arts, which is I believe it's a land-grant college that's in Santa Fe. And it's her recounting of growing up in California in the West. There's Soldiers and Kings, Survival and Hope in the World of Human Smuggling. This is by Jason De Leon. He is an anthropologist. And this book is partly an oral history. Our nonfiction critic, Jen Zalai, reviewed it. It's, as she put it, quote, "It's an account of the nearly 7 years he spent with the people hired by migrants to help them get to the border, the Mexican-American border. A lot of these migrants are coming from parts of Central America, Guatemala, and other nations. And he spends a lot of time with these smugglers, these guides, essentially, who are, who charge people to lead them through danger to what they see as the promised land." You are familiar with our next book, which is Circle of Hope, A Reckoning with Love, Power, and Justice in an American Church. This is by Eliza Griswold.
Yeah, so Eliza Griswold is a journalist she writes pretty often about religion. And so for this book, she embedded with a church, an evangelical church in Philadelphia. And I'm from Ohio, so when I hear evangelical church, my mind goes to a certain idea. And this was completely different than what I expected. So as a lot of evangelical churches across the country moved towards very conservative values, Circle of Hope became very, very progressive. And it's rooted in a tradition that's focused on service, and it's anti-consumerist and nonviolent. It's a pretty fascinating origin story. Its founders were part of a pretty countercultural Christian movement in the 60s and 70s. But in 2020, the church basically imploded over its approach to anti-racism. The church agreed that anti-racism was going to be an important thing for it to embrace and work towards, but there were differences of opinion about how to go about that. And these discussions that were complex but worthwhile ended up very heated with charges of white supremacy, and it got very ugly. And it really scarred a lot of people. But one thing about this is that Eliza Griswold gives every character, the pastor as the leader, a real human portrait. So there are no winners, there are no losers, there are no heroes and villains. You understand the perspective of everybody involved.
The last book we'll mention here, the fifth nonfiction nominee for the National Book Awards this year, is Unshrinking, How to Face Fat Phobia by Kate Mann. Kate Mann is a philosopher. She teaches at Cornell, and this is her third book. Her previous two, one was about misogyny, one was about male privilege. This one is two books in one. It's a history of prejudice against fat people, and I'm using that word because she uses it purposefully. She has said that she uses it proudly in an attempt to reclaim it from its negative connotation. So it's a history of prejudice against fat people, as well as her own personal reflections on the way that prejudice, that bias, has been used against her. So those are our 5 National Book Award nonfiction nominees. Those are our 5 National Book Award fiction nominees. There are 15 other nominees that I urge you all to look up and potentially read. Jumana, thank you, as always, for coming on.
Thank you, Gilbert. I can't wait to see who wins next month.
I'm now joined by Stanley Tucci, an actor known for roles in, among many other movies, The Devil Wears Prada, Julie and Julia, the Hunger Games franchise, and Big Night, which he co-wrote and co-directed, Tucci has added another wing to his career in recent years. He's become a food guy, the host of the CNN food travel series, Stanley Tucci Searching for Italy. He is also the author of 2 cookbooks. In 2021, he published a memoir, Taste, My Life Through Food, and now he's back with What I Ate in 1 Year. Stanley, welcome to the Book Review Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So your new book, What I Ate in 1 Year, I have it right here, is essentially a diary. It begins on January 2nd, 2023. It ends on January 2nd of this year. Why this particular format? And have you actually ever kept a diary before? Was this new to you?
It wasn't really new. I would keep, I still do, make notes quite a bit. If I'm traveling or some of them would be about food, some of them would be about art, some of them would be about whatever. Nothing really incredibly personal, but the people at Simon Schuster wanted me to write another book after Taste. And I really didn't know what to write. And my wife said, just write what you eat in 1 year. So I did, because I do everything she says. And it actually ended up being such a pleasure to write, and it just flowed very easily. And as you start to write about the kind of mundane, all this, you start to mine all this stuff that you didn't know you were thinking about or that was happening. And that's what the book is. It's in essence the sort of the passage of time through the prism of food.
You are an actor, you're a producer, you have directed movies, you've written movies. This is your second book. What is the actual process of writing? Are you sitting and writing? Do you speak into a recorder?
No, I just sit and write. I used to write things longhand and then go on the computer, but now I just do it right on the computer. And also a lot of it, I would be traveling, so sometimes I would just have to make notes, and then I'd revisit it a couple of days later when I had time. And sometimes when I was like filming the show in Italy earlier in the year, I can't even remember now. I remember doing a rewrite on it. I'm jumping, like having a break and just jumping and sitting in a car and writing, what happened 3 days before, or revising something, so it was all sort of a little bit on the fly, and some of it was just at home. I'd go into my office and just write.
Your wife, Felicity, is a well-known literary agent in England where you live now. Does that increase the stakes for you as an author? Do you show it to her? Does she have notes? Is she giving you notes the way that she's giving her clients notes?
Yeah, absolutely. She's great at it. Sometimes, like when I was writing the first book, I'd go like, I'm stuck. I don't know what to write. She goes, remember the story you told me about the blah, blah, blah? And I go, yeah, I do. Is that really? She goes, no, write that. That's a really good story. So she's very encouraging. And of course, she'll remember things that I won't remember, because a lot of times you don't think that something you've done is many times. You think it's anything of substance. So she's very good about that. And like I said, this was her suggestion how to frame this book. And I loved it. It flowed very easily.
It's interesting because early on in this book, even in a city like Rome, where you were at the beginning of last year filming your upcoming film Conclave, you're at Cinecittà, you're in this city where you have filmed before. You filmed at least one of the episodes of your show in Rome. You still give a real sense of the difficulty in finding good food when you're filming on set or you are on location. You talk about bad hotel food. Maybe this is the life of an actor, but you have to be on set so much and it's just hard to find food. So you have to bring your own.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. It's not like we were shooting continuous days, so you didn't really get lunch breaks necessarily, which I actually prefer, because then your day's shorter and then you go out to dinner sooner. Yeah, it's really hard to find, and this is true basically no matter where you're filming. Unless you're filming on the streets and you get a lunch break, then you can walk to a restaurant and get something to eat. And if you're in the right city. But yeah, the catering on movie sets is often pretty terrible, no matter what country you're in.
And in one of your first entries in this book of diary entries, January 3rd, you wrote that you had worked on your script. And I was curious what that actually means as an actor. Are you underlining passages? Are you trying to figure out the intonation, the way in which you'll deliver lines? What is that? How does that work?
You look at how it all connects, and you want to make sure that there is a rhythm there that is truthful and realistic. And I'll just make notes and say, do we need that word in there? Or maybe that could change the sentence. Can we flip those two thoughts or whatever if it doesn't track logically, emotionally, but yeah, it's just that. And then I think I wrote in the book that now I use my phone when you just record the other person's lines and you leave gaps for your own and you just go over it again and again.
I was amused by many things in this book, but one of the things I was amused by was how angry you get at bad meals. You also get angry at airlines, but you get extremely angry at bad meals as if it's a personal affront to you. Have you always been that way, or is it now that you sort of understand what the most magnificent meal can be, that when you encounter a terrible one out, you're just like, God, what is happening here?
No, I was always like that. I was taught to appreciate good food, not fancy food. I'm not talking about Michelin starred food. I'm just talking about good food. I was raised on excellent food. So I know what it takes to make something good. It doesn't take a lot. And that's the part that makes me angry.
But you, because you have a recognizable face, I imagine you have to sit there in a restaurant and just bear it, not be the actor who comes in and complains about their food.
Oh, no. I'm overly polite. Yeah, I'm overly polite. How was everything? Delicious. Absolutely delicious. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't finish. I ate a late lunch. What are you going to say? What are you going to say? I did. There was a place that I went skiing a couple of years ago, and there was a place that we stayed. And I knew the chef who opened the restaurant, and then they put somebody in who runs it and cooks. And the food was inedible. And I called the guy who I knew who owned the place, and he had helped us get a room there. And I said, he goes, how was it? I said, look, the staying there was great. The staff was incredible. They were great, but I have to tell you, and I never do this, I have to tell you that food was awful. I said, it was terrible. Every day it was terrible. And he went, yeah, thank you for telling me. He goes, actually, we've just fired the chef.
We were waiting until you left.
Yeah. Yeah.
You grew up as you wrote in your last book, in a family, an Italian family in which food was at the center. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about it. What does it mean to have food at the center of one's life? Because I see it as we all eat, everyone eats, but it doesn't necessarily mean food is essential to you, important to you. It has a place of honor in your life. How does that sort of demonstrate itself in your life?
Obviously, it has become, it's still the center of my life, but it's also like becoming a huge part of my career. So it's not just, oh, I love to eat. I go to work and then I just love to eat and I love to cook. It's no, now part of it is my job. And I kind of like that. I don't like it all the time. It's nice to be able to go and make a movie, a TV show, to write a book, whatever. But food is a big part of my career now. And food and drink. And it's not so bad.
No, I would think not. What, and maybe this never happens, but what do you do when you meet someone or you encounter someone who maybe just isn't into food? They don't really have opinions. They'll eat whatever. They're not particularly passionate. They don't exclaim, "This is delicious." It's just sort of like fuel for them. That's what some people say.
Yeah, we just try to talk about other things. It's because I will talk a lot about food, and I do have to be careful because I know a lot of people don't share my enthusiasm. But when you find someone who does, it's great, which is basically every single person in Italy. But yeah, it is hard when, I have friends who don't really they're not that interested in it. And they're my dear friends. But everybody has their reasons for not being interested in it. Some people just don't want to eat because they want to stay skinny.
Which is something you never have to encounter in your line of work as an actor, I'm sure.
Yeah.
You were a guest, I don't remember what it was, on Ina Garten's Food Network show, Be My Guest. In your book here, in passing, you write that she's one of your food idols. She is putting out her book ahead a week of yours. What makes her so good and has made her so good, do you think, at sort of writing about food, creating these environments that people want to be a part of for all these decades?
She's so charming. There's a warmth to her. I don't know what it is. It's also when you see watching her cook it's just comforting. And I think she makes everybody really comfortable, and she makes you feel like what any good cook on television does is they make you feel like you can do that too. And she's just sweet with her. She's absolutely beautiful, and she's sort of ageless, and she's just sweet. She just does it. Do you know what I mean?
Believe me, I do.
Yeah.
I talked on a previous podcast about my slight obsession with Ina Garten, so I won't gush over her again. You have now done 2 seasons of your own TV series. You have another one coming out, I believe, a new series on Nat Geo eventually. And it's interesting because you are an actor, a well-known actor, but I think perhaps when one goes out into the world, you're used to being seen, and so you don't want to be seen. You don't want to be stopped all the time by people. But when you're doing a show like the ones that you do, your job is to be out in the world engaging with people, like a reporter in a sense. And I'm wondering how you've had to learn to do that and how maybe you've gotten better at it over certainly the 2 seasons of TV that you've done so far, navigating.
It's actually been it's been like 4 seasons, really. I mean, I started doing it like 5 years ago. So we did 3 seasons for CNN. And now I've just shot 2 seasons back to back for Nat Geo. So it's been a long time. And I'm much more comfortable doing it now, talking to people, understanding how to ask questions that move the narrative forward. So I'm just better about it. Sometimes I watch it, and not sometimes, a lot of times I go, oh God, that's awful. But I'm like that about the movies I direct and performances I give. And there are moments where you go, oh, that's pretty good. That's okay. It is hard because you want to go in sort of like a reporter, just faceless, and just go in and really ask the questions and learn. But I can't do that. And so we have to find the right people. And sometimes we don't. And some of them just get very excited, or they get incredibly nervous, or they'll want to perform and don't perform. Like this is the opposite of performing. And like I said, some people get very nervous, but also a lot of people too they get so excited that they think that you're there to promote them, and you are to a certain extent, but then it starts to turn into they've hired a social media person to come in, and they have this guy come in, and then they try to get another thing, and they're constantly taking photos. Can you hold up my wine? Can you hold up this wine that I got from this guy from the thing? And you're like, no, I can't. I don't do that. No, I'm here to talk to you, and then I'm going home, and then tomorrow I'm going to talk to somebody else.
That sounds incredibly awkward.
It's so awkward sometimes where suddenly like the head of the tourist board of whatever region suddenly shows up because his friend owns the restaurant and then wants to make a deal with you to promote. And you're like, what are you doing? No, I'm here to taste this fella's food because it has an interesting story. And then I'm going home.
Is that where your producer comes in and or your director or what have you?
Lottie, who produces the show with me, she's hyper aware of all this. And we just have to say, no, because it takes away from the purity of what we're doing. I'm not doing the show to promote any one thing. It's simply to tell stories about each region through food.
There is a lot of personal stuff in your new book, of course, but there was a very real moment that stood out to me. I wanted to ask you about it. You sort of briefly talk about your age and you talk about death. And you say, if I can read it, at the age of 63, I probably have another 20 years, 30 if I'm very lucky. But now, as opposed to when I was younger, I know what 20 years is. I know what 30 years is. They're nothing, just a glimpse of life. So one panics, or I do. Therefore, I think of death often, very often, too often perhaps. How does that come to you? You talk a little bit about your family, which is a fascinating thing, designing gravestones as part of their monument business. But I think you also related to the health issues that you've had in your life, the tragedy that you've experienced in your life, and how those things all intermingle. This all happens in 3 paragraphs, but it seemed like there was a lot there.
Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah. Look, it's why they send young people to war, because they don't think they're going to die, and they can run faster at that age. But yeah, I think my wife's death was awful for everybody who loved her and excruciating for her. It was undeserved. And it was a very hard thing to watch, and a very hard thing when you can't control that. And you think you can, but you can't. And that was awful. But growing up, as I said, I think in the book, Italians, especially Southern Italians, talk a lot about death all the time. There are lots of jokes about death. There are lots of, my mother she'd pick up the phone would ring, pick up the phone, and she'd go, oh. Or she goes, wait, I'm not telling this properly. The phone would ring, she'd pick up the phone, she goes, hello. And the big pause, she goes, no, when? And what that was my grandmother calling to tell her that someone had died. And that happened every few weeks, it seemed. No, he did? He was so young. You know what I mean? Those were the conversations. I just saw him. What does that mean? Do you know what I mean? But I just saw him. Yeah, he could still die even if you just saw him. Death was there all the time. And then with the monuments, and then once you experience it in your life, and have friends who have died of cancer far too young, and my wife, like I said, and then I got cancer. It's all over them. It's always there. And let's not pretend it isn't.
It definitely strikes me, and again, you're someone who's loved food for your entire life, but it seems like this slight turn in your career, unconsciously or not, it's sort of like an embracing of this amazing part of life, which is food, as sort of an antidote to the terrible darkness on the other side. Just, I love this thing. I had this terrible thing happen to me. I want to experience this kind of pleasure as often as I can and show others how wonderful it can be.
Yeah. Yeah. That's exactly it. Because life is too short. So make your dinners longer.
Yeah. Yes. Is that written somewhere? Are you going to get that on like a little...
Oh, I just made it up.
That's great. Off the dome.
You can use it.
I think you just trademarked it. It's so funny because I've had an Italian stepmother for like 20 plus years now. And I definitely feel as if I've heard something similar.
There was a lot of death there particularly in southern Italy. They were dirt poor, and kids didn't live very long, and people didn't live very long. If you think about all the invasions, all the wars that they saw, that they were sent away to fight for somebody who they'd never met or would never meet. my grandfather being one of them, who luckily lived to be 92, but he fought in World War I. Most of those soldiers were Southern Italian soldiers.
And so did you see you say most Sundays of my childhood were spent in the Peekskill Cemetery. Your dad was an artist, your uncle was an architect. Did you actually physically see them working on gravestones?
No, I saw the designs. They didn't actually build. There were
sketch it out
laborers who. Yeah, they designed them. They were. My father designed my mom's parents' grave. I remember him designing that when my grandfather died. He designed. Yeah, friends would ask him, "Would you design?" And he would do it, just as a gesture of friendship, because it's nice to know that, because he would know the person and he'd give them ideas like, we can put this on it, we can do this on it, little things that are like to remember that person by, certain things that they like. With my grandfather, he did beautiful like grapes and grape leaves in one corner of it's very pretty. I find them beautiful. I love going to cemeteries. I love them.
Absolutely. I was going to say, if you only think about it for 5 seconds, it seems morbid. But if you think about it for 10 seconds, what more lasting gift can you give someone than a beautifully designed marker for where they rest?
It's true. And there's a cemetery right near where I live, within walking distance. And it was part of a church that is now deconsecrated. So this cemetery has some incredibly beautiful old gravestones, and it's in complete disrepair because the thing has been deconsecrated. And you have World War I veterans there, you have Crimea War veterans there, you have children, and it goes back to the 1700s, some of them. Absolutely beautiful. And I walk through it. Like, I'd love to go with my kids. They're fascinated by it. But I always thought, I wish I could just put it back the way it's supposed to be, because I hate the fact that nobody looks after those people anymore.
Speaking of the past, I feel like I'm finding these little sentences in your book, but they're the ones that stood out to me. You write about something that I'd never heard of before a few years ago when I was in London, and I picked up a book, and the book was called Mudlarking. And I was like, what is this word? And I guess if you live over there where you live, one knows what it is, but I didn't. And you write, it's why you love finding stuff from the past, and it's why you love mudlarking along the Thames. Exhuming remains of past lives holds endless fascination for me. You write, what the heck is mudlarking?
Okay, so mudlarking has been around for centuries, actually.
I'm just coming to it, so catch me up. So
the Thames is a tidal, but down by London, it's all tidal. So once you have low tide, you have the foreshore, which is all mud. I mean, it's kind of gross. Not kind of, it actually is gross. And what you do is basically, because you have to remember that London is so old, right? There were settlements here before the Romans, but the Romans are the ones who founded London. So, if I'm not mistaken, it's Cirencester and London, where there are two, Cirencester actually being the first one, major Roman cities that they built. So if you think that's 2,000 years ago, in that mud, people are finding all the time Roman coins, Roman bottles, Roman pottery, Viking swords, and it goes all the way up through the centuries. It is absolutely one of the most fascinating ways to spend a couple hours. And people, you have to have a permit for it. I have a permit.
Really? Who gives you a permit?
The city or the permit people.
Yeah.
And I think they're not issuing them anymore because I think too many people were doing it. So I got in at the right time, but I really love doing it. And I take my son down, and I could do it for forever. Of course, obviously, you have a limited period of time because that tide's coming in.
Yeah.
It's really funny. And you get so caught up in it that suddenly you turn around and the water is right And you think it's like when you're painting or fishing or what, just suddenly you're like, oh, the sunset. I had that happen. And it's the same with the tides.
Is it a meditative thing? Or are you just walking along the foreshore?
Completely.
And just...
Yeah, you're outside. It's really nice. Sometimes it's really gross, like I said. But it's just beautiful. London and England has that. It has weather that you never know what's going to happen. So suddenly you go out mudlarking and it's a sunny day, and 20 minutes later, it's like pouring and it's freezing. I love that.
You're such a New York guy. You grew up in Westchester, lived in New York for a while. You've lived other places, but now you live in one of the other great cities of the world. It's not New York, but one of the other great cities, London. And as we approach the close of this interview, I'm just curious how you've made the transition and what it's like there, and what it's like for this New Yorker to be sort of rained on all the time.
I love it here. This is where I was supposed to live, but I didn't know it.
Wow.
And so I feel more comfortable here than I even did in New York. And I hadn't lived in the city for a long time. I was living in Westchester, but I lived there after school. I lived there for quite some time. But I think London, I don't know, it just suits me better. And like I said, I think in the book that, I love the history of it. The fact that the Romans founded it.
Stanley, even in London, you cannot get away from the Italians.
There are more Italians here and now, meaning Italians, here in London than there are in New York City.
That's it. That's why you love it. That's why Stanley Tucci, author of this year's What I Ate in 1 Year. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Book Review Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was my check-in with Jumana Khatib about some of this year's National Book Award nominees and my conversation with Stanley Tucci about his book, What I Ate in 1 Year. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thanks for listening.